Good afternoon, YouTube viewers. My name is Tom Loewy. I'm a reporter and columnist from the Galesburg Register-Mail. And this is our very first time doing a live video on YouTube. So this is kind of a beta test, and my plan is to see how things kind of go. We are frankly just kind of experimenting with YouTube as a further platform, social media platform, to broadcast content over. So we're taking the time to do a little bit of a drive today. It's Monday, February 18th, and so we're going to broadcast a little bit of my journey today. I'm going to tell you about what we have going on and the story that I'm working on and some of the things that I'm looking at as the week goes on. So obviously, weather's been a huge story and continued to be a little bit of a story. Friday night, it got pretty slick because we had a melt, and then we had a freeze. And so there were some travel issues Friday night here in Knox County and in Galesburg. 74 in portions, was quite slick. We got through Saturday, and then Saturday into Sunday, we got some snow. Fortunately, we did not get the 2 to 5 inches that were forecast for originally for Friday, the day after, or the couple days after Valentine's Day. But so we didn't get that. We got a little bit of a dusting, maybe up to maybe 2 inches the other night, and that was fine. It wasn't that big of a deal. So Sunday we had a little bit of snow to deal with. And now it looks like we're going to see some pretty, now by warmer I mean like over 20 degrees, right? But we're going to see some pretty consistent temperatures, a little bit warmer. We may have various forms of precipitation throughout the week. But so the week coming up, important stuff going on tonight at the City Council. I'd encourage everybody to watch the City Council broadcast on public television or to actually attend. One of the things that they're doing in a consent vote, and that means at the beginning of every, near the beginning of every regular City Council meeting, they have a consent vote on things like, it's typically supplies, it's typically endorsements, showing council support for different things, and then sometimes it's items under certain dollar amounts. They're kind of lumped in together, and they get it out of the way quick. But lumped into the consent vote tonight is City Council support for ongoing lead remediation efforts, and this time it's aimed squarely at lead paint in homes. And so that's an important program. We have a story that's on Galesburg.com and the Register Mail Facebook page. If you want to take a look at that, it kind of outlines. Wayne Carl was good enough to sit down and kind of explain the whole thing for me. And I got a little bit of feedback from some of the council members. I think lead is still, it's one of those ongoing kind of silent issues. It became a huge issue after the AP broke a big story that was misleading. It led people to think that there was lead in our water supply. And in point of fact, there's not lead in our water supply. There's lead in some of the homes in Galesburg, in the line that runs from the home to the city's water line. So they're called service lines, and some of those were lead, okay? And so and it was definitely what prompted the AP to look at things was elevated lead levels in children throughout the city and the county. And so they then tied that to lead being in the water because of like the Flint issue. And there was an attempt kind of to ride on that Flint story and make Galesburg a kind of small town version of Flint, which, look, it was a small town version of lead poisoning. I mean, the argument against the story is not an argument against children being poisoned by lead. Let's be very clear about that. But a high percentage of lead poisoning comes from environmental lead. And it also has to, lead service lines deal with the fact that homes were built before 1978, when there were widespread laws that said that you couldn't use lead in water pipes and you couldn't use lead in paint. Well, we have a lot of older homes, and lead paint was commonplace. You can ride down any street and see lead peeling off of paint on porches. No doubt about it. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of lead in Galesburg homes. And so this is going to start to help people deal with it. And so it's an important story. It's one that you don't tell on a daily basis or a weekly basis, or even after kind of breaking it down, that you tell on a monthly basis. But it's really important to revisit that story. And that's what I did for the weekend in the run up to Monday. Another important factor ongoing Monday that I think is an important story for the community in another way. And it deals a little bit with environmental issues and lead issues. And that is this. There are 4 more properties on the city's demolition list. And the city, I think people have to be very involved in this. Personally, I'm very supportive of it. I think you get out, just like, landscaping, right? You cityscape, you urbanscape, you neighborhoodscape. And that means when things are abandoned and they start to run down, you take them down, you get them out. Now, preferably, you make the owners pay for it. But you know what? I mean, we have a system set up where, a lot of people talk about accountability, right? A lot of people talk about accountability. And a lot of people talk about people who need to be accountable. And usually what they're talking about are poor people who need to be accountable. And they need to be accountable to like some kind of law enforcement or some kind of social thing. But one of the things that we don't talk a lot about is the need for property owners to be accountable. So like with the lead issue, what's clear is that for decades in this city, homes with lead service lines and lead paint were both rented and sold to people for decades after the 1978 law. Otherwise, how do we get to 2016 with a lead poisoning issue, a definable, describable, statistical group of children who have persistent lead poisoning in Galesburg? Well, it's because they live in homes that are contaminated by lead dust and water that's getting some lead in it. It's not rocket science. So, while we call for accountability, a lot of times property owners, in point of fact, are kind of, cities are oftentimes hamstrung with what they can do with property owners, which is understandable on a level. But abandoned homes is something that we can clearly see aggressive action being taken by the city. And I think I mean, this is part of what we have government for, right? Is I think, the government can encourage people to clean up their neighborhoods, to clean up their properties. And when that doesn't work, they can show people what aggressive cleanup efforts look like. And so later today, I'm going to be doing some videos in advance of the city council meeting, showing you those properties that are being taken down and kind of explaining a little bit about each one of them. Now, this is something that I tried to do on Friday, but the wind chill was so bad outside that it was shutting down, and we weren't below zero, right? But the wind chill for some reason was shutting my iPhone down. It was basically draining the battery in a matter of minutes. I think I was on air for maybe 3 minutes and 15 seconds, and my battery literally went from full to empty or uncharged or whatever the technical cell phone terminology is for that. So be aware, I am going to do some live video over on Facebook, kind of showing people some of these properties and explaining, you know, what the city has described. I think there's a lot of interest in these efforts. I think there's a lot of concern in neighborhoods where houses are left empty, or businesses, buildings that were like on Chambers Street. It was obviously like a business, but then it had an apartment up above, and it was obvious. When it was built, it was probably a really nice looking property. Like, had this been maintained, we wouldn't be talking about it. But when businesses go under and then they leave empty spaces, uh, eventually the city's going to have to deal with it, and or the people of the city are going to have to deal with it, because more often than not, the deeds are bought up by banks or by mortgage lenders or whatever. They take on properties, and then they kind of use some aspects of it for tax write-offs, for tax purposes, or for ownership volume purposes, to show investors volume of ownerships, property ownership, just stuff like that. And so you end up with like a Bahamian based, and this is the case in Galesburg. I'm using an extreme, but you end up with an out of town brokerage owning a property, right? And then oftentimes they attempted to flip them, and there's been some of this going on in Galesburg on a very low level. But you'll see a for sale sign out in front with a number to call, and then you call that number, and it's like a brokerage in some other city, some other state, right? And then they'll send a code to a key lock on the door, and it'll be open for a certain period of time. And you walk in, and oftentimes I went to one time, right, over on Grand Avenue, and it was a joke. It was like they wanted like $75,000 for like a house the Manson family wouldn't live in, right? It was a joke, and so these properties are oftentimes bought up by those kinds of firms, and then discarded. They just become, at a certain point, they become valueless because they've simply been. You can't leave a house, you can't leave a building unattended, without heat, without working water, and then expect to come back into it and have it be pristine. We know that time just, whether it's through people, or we know that, like raccoons, they get into places. There are more raccoons living in urban America now than in the wilderness. You're more likely to see a raccoon in the Bronx than you are, if you go walking out in the woods. And that's a fact. And one of the reasons is because in cities and in towns, raccoons have readily available food that's discarded almost on a daily basis, right? And then they have oftentimes readily available shelter. And sometimes it's warmed. If you can get into an area as a raccoon like that is still somewhat maintained, you can actually be a lot warmer than your wilderness counterparts ever will be. But so that's the problem, is you get animals in there, and then it doesn't take long for properties to completely lose their value, to be completely unsalvageable. And there aren't a ton of these homes, but there are a number of homes in Galesburg that are not salvageable. They need to come down. Period. You hate to leave empty spots, but it's better to have an empty spot than have something that your kid can wander into in the middle of the afternoon and end up, getting injured or worse. And that has not happened in Galesburg that I know of, but it does occasionally happen in places, typically cities. I mean, anybody who's grown up in a city, there's empty buildings, and when that happens, those are magnets for raccoons and rats and birds, and they're kid magnets. They're kid magnets. So that's kind of what I'm going to be paying attention to tonight at the city council meeting. There's also a settlement that's being paid by the city to an individual for a handy van accident, and that the payment's going to be in the amount of $75,000 to a Georgie Johnson. And so I'm on the trail of finding out what that's all about. So if anybody has any inside information on that, feel free to contact me via email or comments or via Facebook. So this has been our first ever Driving with Loewy on YouTube. And we are going to we're going to work with some content on YouTube. And so with YouTube Live, so we'd really like any kind of feedback we can get from folks who watched this or watched a kind of archived iteration of it. We'd be interested in finding out what you thought. My name is Tom Loewy. You've been driving with Loewy very briefly, and I want to thank you for joining me today. There will be a regular Facebook edition of happening now, and there may be a Facebook edition, a Facebook Live edition of Driving with Loewy. But for now, thanks, folks. I appreciate your time.